many more we have? For what purpose does the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to the order of the House on November 1st, I call up House Resolution 599 and I ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 599, resolution expressing the sense of the House of Representatives with respect to the United States policy towards Yemen and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the order of the House of Wednesday, November 1st, 2017, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
I ask that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend and to include any extraneous material for the record.
Without objection.
I want to thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, including the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, for working in good faith towards achieving a resolution that productively addresses a very complex issue, a very serious issue, and namely that is the strategic and humanitarian implications of the ongoing conflict being fought in Yemen. I should also recognize the good work of our Foreign Affairs Committee ranking member, Mr. Elliot Engel of New York. So this resolution will send a strong and needed message to all involved in this conflict that is causing so much human suffering. According to the UN, more than 20 million people in Yemen, now that's 76% of the population, are in need of humanitarian assistance. More than 2 million people are affected by either moderate or by severe malnutrition. Mr. Speaker, House Resolution 599 is a bipartisan alternative to House Concurrent Resolution 81. That initial proposal had claimed procedural privileges by invoking Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution, which applies only when U.S. forces are engaged in hostilities abroad without authorization. Though we provide logistics to our Saudi partners in the region, United States forces are not conducting hostilities against Houthi forces in Yemen. The initial resolution also neglected a key facet of the Yemen crisis, and that is Iran, which has been providing increasing support, very nefarious support, to the Houthi rebels. We must not forget that in April of 2015, the UN Security Council, acting under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, condemned the violent Houthi government overthrow, quote, in the strongest terms, and obligated all UN member states to comply with and enforce an embargo on arms and military assistance, quote, of all types, unquote, to the Houthi forces. This makes Iran's acts to fuel this deadly conflict a gross violation of international law, as our ambassador has pointed out. I am glad that the new House Resolution 599 addresses these shortcomings, and I rise to support it today. Even before this latest conflict, Yemen was the poorest country in the region. It was racked by violence and unrest. For years, the countries of North and South Yemen were in conflict before they became a single state. That was in 1990. After an uprising in 2011, Yemen embarked on a path of attempted national dialogue, of unification, of constitutional reform. But hopes for stability, hopes for that progress were dashed in 2014, and at that time, that is when an Iranian-backed Houthi rebel group, in alliance with former Yemeni strongman Ali Abdullah Saleh, forcibly deposed the internationally recognized government, the government of President Hodi. In response, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 2216, which sanctioned individuals involved in destabilizing Yemen and demanded that the Houthis unconditionally end their use of violence, withdraw their forces, relinquish their seized weapons, and refrain from threats to neighboring states. Unfortunately, the Houthi Saleh rejection of this UN Security Council resolution, with Iran's backing, has sabotaged the prospects for peace. Mr. Speaker, the United States has long-standing critical national security interests in this region. Members will recall that the deadly bombing of the USS Cole occurred there in Yemen. Other terrorist plots against Americans originated in Yemen, including the unsuccessful 2009 underwear bomber attack on a Northwest Airlines flight that was going to Detroit. We and our partners continue to conduct operations against al-Qaeda inside Yemen, and that is pursuant to the 2001 authorization of use of military force with the permission of the internationally recognized government of Yemen. Although al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula may not grab a lot of international headlines, it still continues to threaten Western nations. It still maintains a significant network in southern Yemen, which we are working to disrupt. Making matters worse, Yemen has become another front in Iran's quest for regional dominance, which has accelerated in the wake of the previous administration's nuclear deal. Consider that Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps has transferred increasingly sophisticated weapons systems to the Houthis and specialists to train and advise their units. Iran's top terror proxy, Hezbollah, is helping the Houthis, who have launched numerous missiles and numerous raids into Saudi Arabia, killing innocent civilians. Just last week, a ballistic missile was intercepted over the Saudi capital of Riyadh. This Iranian meddling in Yemen thwarts peace by empowering the Houthis to resist a return to political negotiations. The Iranian regime could not care less about the human suffering it's responsible for. Of course, beyond our national security, the region is also vital to the U.S. and to the global economy. The southwest coast of Yemen constitutes one side of the Bab al-Mandab Strait, a narrow strategic choke point in the flow of international goods headed to and from Europe and Asia and the United States. At times, Iranian-supported Houthis have attacked international shipping, including attacking an American vessel. Disruptions to shipping along this waterway means disruption to employment and wages. So it is no wonder that in response to these threats, a Saudi-led coalition of 10 nations began military operations against Houthi Saleh forces in March of 2015. Its mission was to reinstate the internationally recognized government. 2.5 years later, however, military progress remains elusive and battle lines are hardened. The Saudi-led coalition controls the port city of Aden and the lowland areas in the south, while the Houthis continue to hold the capital and the highlands there of northern Yemen. Civilian casualties have been distressingly high, including from Saudi airstrikes in the early months of the campaign. Today, Yemen is in shambles. It is simultaneously experiencing the world's largest food insecurity crisis and largest cholera outbreak. More than 900,000 suspected cases. And last week's moves by the Saudis to further close ground and air and seaports only threatens to make things worse. The United States remains committed to providing much-needed relief to innocent men and women and children affected by this crisis. In fact, we remain the single largest donor of humanitarian aid to Yemen by far. USAID and UN aid agencies report that all parties to the conflict, including the Saudi-led coalition, have been responsible for bureaucratic impediments and disruptions to humanitarian operations, complicating our ability to effectively deliver life-saving assistance. Our resolution says this must stop by all sides. Mr. Speaker, this all provides for a very complex policy challenge. Some say the United States should distance itself from long-standing military cooperation with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf Cooperation Council partners. But this would only strengthen Iran's malign influence in the region and would not solve the humanitarian crisis. Indeed, it would likely worsen it. At the same time, others say our only focus should be neutralizing Iran and terrorist threats. But we cannot ignore the moral and strategic costs of civilian casualties and deteriorating humanitarian conditions. To this end, I believe that House Resolution 599 appropriately balances the shared bipartisan concerns of this body. The urgent need for a political solution in Yemen, consistent with Security Council Resolution 2216, a call for all parties to prevent civilian casualties, support for the Saudi-led coalition's commitments to improve targeting and abide by their no-strike list, and condemnation and sanctions for Iran's destabilizing activities in Yemen in violation of that Security Council Resolution 2216. Here we should note that this body has taken strong bipartisan action in recent months to challenge Iran's aggression, including by sanctioning its ICBM program and its support for the terrorist group Hezbollah. And make no mistake about it, Iran is an avowed enemy and our biggest security threat in the region. And on the other hand, the Saudis are our partners. The resolution calls for all parties to allow unobstructed access for humanitarian organizations, human rights investigations, medical personnel, and journalists. And in general, it brings attention to a Yemeni conflict that deserves more international notice. As we debate this measure, I suspect we may hear different views of war powers and authorizations for the use of military force as they relate to Yemen. As I said, I don't believe our security cooperation with the Saudis triggers war powers. This is the type of support we provide to many other governments. But just because it does not arise under that particular statute does not make it immune from our scrutiny. I share members' concerns that Congress must be as attentive as possible to the roles and missions of our armed forces overseas and monitor the ways in which our security assistance is being used. In this sense, Yemen does warrant closer watching, and that is what I believe this resolution does. So I again want to thank the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, the majority leader and minority whip of the House, and my good friend and ranking member Elliot Engel for the good work that went into this text, which I support. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Chairman Royce for his work on this resolution, Ranking Member Engel, leadership on both sides, Majority Leader McCarthy and the Speaker, and Minority Whip Hoyer and Leader Pelosi. I think one thing we can all agree on, as Chairman Royce mentioned, is the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. It is arguably the largest humanitarian crisis currently in the world. There are almost 1 million people suffering from cholera, and this is a man-made crisis because of bombing of civilian targets, bombing of electricity areas, bombing that has made the treatment of water impossible. Almost 7 million people face famine. One hope out of this debate, the first debate in the House floor on Yemen, is that we will collectively demand humanitarian access to people in Yemen. There is no justification for the ports to be closed. There is no justification for the Khanna airport to be closed. Just in the New York Times this morning, there was an article that chlorine medicine tablets are not being allowed in to people suffering from cholera. That is not a Republican or Democratic issue. That is an American issue. This nation stands for human rights. We stand for compassion and decency, and we should demand collectively that there is humanitarian access to people who are suffering, that the ports be opened, that the airports be opened, and this resolution calls for that, as has our UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, made that clear. The second part of this resolution that I think goes a long way is the acknowledgement of our own role in the refueling of Saudi planes and in the assistance of Saudi targeting. The resolution explicitly acknowledges that the United States has been engaged in the assistance of Saudi refueling and assisting the Saudis in targeting. And it explicitly also recognizes that the 2001 authorization of force that the United States Congress passed does not apply to the Yemenis civil war. Chairman Royce was absolutely correct that there is an al-Qaeda threat in Yemen to the United States. And our military, under the 2001 authorization of force, has the full authority to take counterterrorism measures to deal with al-Qaeda. But what our military is not authorized to do is assist the Saudi Arabian regime in fighting the Houthis. In many cases, the Saudis have aligned with al-Qaeda to fight the Houthis, undermining our very counterterrorism operations. And so this resolution makes abundantly clear that we cannot be assisting the Saudi regime in any of its fight with the Houthi regime, and we have to limit our involvement in Yemen to take on al-Qaeda and to take on the terrorists that threaten the United States. Now, Chairman and I have a disagreement about the War Powers resolution, but I will say that the negotiations were in good faith, and as I told some of the groups that were upset about the resolution, this is a body of 435 members, and every member has their perspective, but ultimately we have to come to a consensus that moves the debate forward. In our view, the War Powers resolution does apply. If I can quote from a plain reading of Section 8C, it says that for the purposes of the War Powers Act, the introduction of United States armed forces includes the assignment of member of such armed forces to command, coordinate, participate in the movement of or accompany the regular or irregular military forces of any foreign country or government. I believe a plain reading of that statute suggests that refueling Saudi planes constitutes the coordination with a foreign government in a foreign conflict. Frankly, it's precisely what the drafters of the statute wanted to prevent after Vietnam. They wanted to prevent us from getting entangled in foreign conflicts where our national security was not at stake without a debate in the floor of Congress. We currently have troops in harm's way in 13 countries around the world. And in many of those countries, we have not debated in the United States Congress what the mission is, or whether we should be there, or whether it's making us any safer. And that's certainly the case in Yemen. We know that to the extent that Iran is involved with the Houthis, that has been exacerbated because of the Saudi actions. It's debatable how much Iran was involved in the first place. But what we do know is that their minimal involvement, or perhaps now greater involvement, was triggered because of the Saudi escalation in bombing Yemen. Now, what is the United States' stake in a proxy war in Yemen? How is that making us any safer? If anything, it's creating another generation of Yemenis who will view the United States with suspicion. Nicholas Kristof wrote in the New York Times, quote, "We Americans have sometimes wondered how Russia can possibly be so Machiavellian as to support its Syrian government allies as they bomb and starve civilians. Yet we're doing the same thing with Saudi Arabia, and it's just as unconscionable when we're the ones complicit." Our military has the highest standards. We take such great care in minimizing civilian casualties. Why would we want to aid Saudi Arabia, which doesn't share American values, which doesn't have the regard for human life that we in the United States do? We are bearing the brunt of their horrible actions. And so it's time, I believe, not just to stand up for humanitarian access in Yemen, but to question whether the aid that we're providing Saudi Arabia is making our country any safer, whether it's consistent with American values. And finally, I will say to those who argue that we need to support the Saudis as a counter to Iran, there is no question that Iran has taken actions that are not in the United States' interest. But I suggest that we learn from our own history. I remember from history the time where so many in our country said, "Let us arm Saddam Hussein to be a counter to Iran." And that didn't work out so well for the United States. It was our arms that fueled Saddam Hussein's rise that led to 2 costly wars for the United States. My belief is the balance of power framework that has dictated our foreign policy and the interventionism has not made us any safer. I wish we would exercise more restraint in our foreign policy and return to the traditions of John Quincy Adams, who said that we should not go overseas for monsters to destroy. These are not conflicts where we can judge who is on the right side. Rather, we should be restrained, offer our hopes and prayers to those fighting for freedom, offer our humanitarian goodwill, but not engage in interventionism abroad. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Khan, reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
I yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida, Eliana Ross-Layton. She's the chairman emeritus of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and she chairs the subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my good friend, the chairman of our committee, for yielding me the time. And I rise today in support of House Resolution 599, expressing the sense of the U.S. House of Representatives with respect to United States policy toward Yemen. I want to thank my other colleague from California, Mr. Khanna, and Mr. McGovern from Massachusetts for offering this important resolution before us. I want to thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for always working in a bipartisan manner in our committee, including with our leadership, to bring this resolution before us today. Mr. Speaker, there are approximately 2 million internally displaced persons in Yemen right now, and international aid agencies consider Yemen to be one of the 4 current famine countries, alongside South Sudan, Somalia, and Nigeria. We must ensure that access and safe passage is being given to reach the people of Yemen who desperately need this assistance. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have security and terror concerns in Yemen, and they have to mitigate those, but there should not be any obstacles to prevent the delivery of vital humanitarian assistance to Yemen. It is positive news that this morning Saudi Arabia announced that it will begin reopening airports and seaports in Yemen, and so hopefully that aid will come quickly for those starving people. Since this campaign began in 2015, the United States has been the largest contributor of humanitarian aid to Yemen, the largest. So we must ensure that the aid is not being diverted and is actually reaching the right people who need it the most. A political solution is needed in Yemen where all parties can sit down and negotiate a path forward. But that becomes increasingly more difficult when we have to deal with the negative influence of Iran and the Houthis. Here are some examples. In February 2017, General Soleimani, commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Quds Force, reportedly pledged to increase Iran's assistance to Houthi Saleh forces. According to press reports, 2 incidents occurred in October 2016 off the coast of Yemen, where missiles were fired targeting our Navy destroyers. After Houthi forces targeted U.S. warships near Yemen, the Vice Admiral who heads U.S. Naval Forces Central Command said, quote, "We believe that Iran is connected to this," end quote. Since April 2015, U.S. warships have intercepted at least 5 Iranian shipments of weapons to Houthi forces. And just last week, the U.S. Forces Central Commander said that a missile fired by the Houthis at Riyadh was manufactured by Iran. So in Yemen, we cannot forget that we need to undermine Iran's influence over the Houthis. Last month, the White House released a new strategy when it comes to Iran, and it stated, quote, "The Iranian regime has taken advantage of regional conflicts and instability to aggressively expand its regional influence and threaten its neighbors with little domestic or international cost for its actions," end quote. I believe that targeted sanctions are needed against Iran for providing weapons to the Houthis, weapons that are being used to directly target U.S. soldiers in the region. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, we cannot forget about the threats emanating from a U.S. designated foreign terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, also known as AQAP. The United States must continue to operate and conduct operations in Yemen to counter the threats from AQAP. But we cannot do it alone. A few months ago, the UAE and the U.S. teamed up with local Yemeni forces to target AQAP militants. This is another positive sign in the region where we can partner with our Gulf partners to fight extremist elements jointly. These operations are essential to protecting our national security interests and to help bring regional stability in the region. So while a lot of the focus is traditionally put on Hezbollah and Hamas in the region, we cannot forget about the dangerous, malign, and illicit activities that Iran is undertaking through its proxy in Yemen, the Houthis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of our time. Thank you to our chairman.
The gentlelady from Florida yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, who has been a real advocate and champion for the War Powers Act in this institution.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I want to thank the gentleman from California for yielding me the time and for his leadership to bring before this House the critical issue of U.S. policy towards Yemen. Most importantly, I want to thank him for his determination to provide this House with at least 30 minutes to debate the complicity of the United States through its support of the Saudi-led forces in the civil war in Yemen in one of the greatest humanitarian crises taking place on this planet. I personally believe that the House should be considering Mr. Khanna's original resolution, H-Con Res 81, but Republican leaders made that impossible by threatening to put forward a rule that would have blocked the right of Congressman Khanna to ever call his privileged resolution up for debate. Mr. Speaker, according to the United Nations, Yemen is suffering the fastest growing cholera epidemic ever recorded. At the same time, Yemen faces the world's biggest food emergency. Saudi Arabia has blocked Yemen's ports and airports. Just last week, it sealed the country's borders. As a result, the people of Yemen have been cut off from nearly all humanitarian aid during this horrific famine and cholera epidemic, and the ability of humanitarian agencies to provide relief has been significantly impeded. The UN has called the Saudi closure of Yemen borders to aid deliveries catastrophic. Even the International Committee of the Red Cross was forbidden to cross the northern border with a delivery of chlorine tablets to prevent cholera. We learned today from the Saudis that 2 smaller southern ports and 1 Red Sea port will be opened soon, although we don't know what that means. But the main port, where over 80% of Yemen's food supplies enter, will remain blockaded and closed. Mr. Speaker, it is well documented that the Saudi-led coalition, and Saudi forces in particular, have carried out a ruthless, brutal bombing campaign that deliberately targets hospitals, schools, food markets, and civilian population, including children. The World Food Program has warned that hundreds of thousands of children will be on the brink of starvation if the blockade lasts for even 2 weeks. That deadline of death and starvation will arrive next Tuesday, just 2 days before we here in the United States sit down to enjoy our Thanksgiving with our family, friends, and loved ones. Will the members of this House spare a thought for the children, mothers, and fathers of Yemen as we sit down and feast in the warmth and comfort of our own homes? Or will this Congress finally, after more than 2.5 years of sheer horror, send a clear message to Saudi Arabia that its actions are intolerable? Mr. Speaker, Saudi Arabia's actions thus far and the coalition it leads in the Yemen civil war may very well rise to the level of war crimes and crimes against humanity, according to the United Nations. It is past time for this House to clearly and unambiguously declare that the United States will no longer provide or sell military aid, equipment, and munitions to potential war criminals. That the United States will no longer supply mid-air refueling to Saudi and coalition bombers headed to Yemen to wreak havoc on the suffering Yemeni people. That the U.S. will no longer share intelligence with the Saudi coalition, and that we will no longer remain a complicit and passive partner in carrying out one of the world's greatest humanitarian crises. Mr. Speaker, I know the Houthi rebels attempting to take power in Yemen are also guilty of war crimes. Last November, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission held a hearing on the human rights situation and humanitarian crisis in Yemen, so I know full well the atrocities committed by all parties in this war. But, Mr. Speaker, Yemen is just one more proxy in the regional religious and political struggle for dominance between Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shiite Iran. For some in Congress, that power struggle trumps every other consideration. For me, it's yet another reason to act with extreme caution and examine whether and how we allow ourselves to support potential war criminals in pursuit of consolidating their own regional agenda and power. I'm concerned that this power struggle is escalating further throughout the region. Rather than the U.S. policy working to cool things down, we seem to be encouraging it to heat up. I, for one, Mr. Speaker, do not want the United States to be complicit in supporting the killing and maiming of children. I do not want the United States to be complicit in the deliberate targeting and attacks against schools, hospitals, markets, and homes. And I don't want the United States to be complicit in bombing water treatment plants at any time, let alone in the middle of the worst cholera epidemic in the world. And I do not want the United States to be complicit in supporting a blockade that condemns tens of thousands of children to famine and death by starvation. Once again, I thank Congressman Khanna and my other colleagues who have supported this effort to have this debate. I want to thank them for their leadership on this important issue. But this is serious, and again, thank you, Mr. Khanna, for leading us in this debate. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts yields. The gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Speaker. So the purpose of this resolution is to pressure the Saudis to take those steps to reopen access to those ports. That is what we're doing. We need to be talking about the other aspect of what we're also trying to do here, and that is to try to get the Houthis to respond to the actions taken by the UN, to try to get the Houthis to lift their impediments that they have put in place. They need to respect the neutrality of aid and stop diverting humanitarian convoys away from those who are in need, as we know that from the UN that this is the problem. And the Houthis, according to the United Nations, need to accept the UN plan that would allow for neutral actors to administer the port of Hodeidah so deliveries of essential food and medicines can resume. Part of our difficulty here is the Houthis are or have become, under the tutelage here of their Iranian supporters, they're a minority in Yemen, but Iran uses them to exploit divisions within Yemeni society. This is part of the complexity of this. The Houthis' slogan is derived from Iran's own anti-U.S. slogans. Their slogan, if you listen to them on the broadcast, is death to America, death to Israel, damn the Jews. Now, they didn't pick that up on their own. Part of the problem here is the leaders of the Houthi militia were indoctrinated in Qom, in Iran, as part of an Iranian attempt to construct a Hezbollah-like proxy in Yemen. They've done it. And so now what we are trying to do is figure out a way to both convince them to reopen the port under the UN auspices here for these deliveries, and convince the Saudis and the other members of this coalition that they should cooperate on this access as well. This is the attempt of this resolution, and I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mike McCall, chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of this resolution, expressing the urgent need for a political solution in Yemen. As the civil war in Yemen continues well into its third year, the situation on the ground becomes more dire by the day. Despite multiple international attempts to broker a political agreement to end the human suffering, peace remains elusive. And meanwhile, Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula, also known as AQAP, has taken advantage of this power vacuum created by the conflict. This has allowed them to expand into the southern and eastern ports of Yemen, where they continue to plot external operations against the United States. Simultaneously, much like in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, Iran continues its campaign of influence in Yemen, where its actions have prolonged the conflict and exacerbated the political and humanitarian nightmare. As highlighted by Secretary Mattis, everywhere you look, if there is trouble in the region, you find Iran. This is not by coincidence. As Prime Minister Netanyahu emphasized to our congressional delegation on a recent trip to Israel, Iran has been working around the clock to solidify its presence across the region through the establishment of a land bridge from Iraq to Lebanon, commonly referred to as a Shia Crescent. Despite a United Nations authorized arms embargo against the Houthis, Iran on multiple occasions has been caught attempting to smuggle weapons, ammunition into the region. They have also provided technical assistance to the Houthis, enabling them to manufacture ballistic missiles, and Saudi Arabia is often their main target. In order to protect their security interest of the Saudi people, the government in Riyadh has taken defense actions to both limit Iranian support to the Houthis, such as blockades, as well as offensive measures to stem attacks on the kingdom, such as an unsuccessful ballistic missile attack on the capital just earlier this month. However, while Saudi Arabia has the right to prioritize its security, we cannot dismiss the effects of its actions on the grave humanitarian suffering on the ground, where more than 27 million face an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. As such, this resolution rightly highlights the need for a political solution to this conflict and condemns Iranian activities that undermine peace efforts. Furthermore, it calls on all parties of the conflict to take additional measures to prevent civilian casualties and increase much-needed humanitarian access. Lastly, this resolution encourages the international community to join in providing the resources necessary to address this crisis. I commend all those involved. It's a real threat that I see as Chairman of Homeland Security every day, and I want to thank the Chairman for bringing this, and the gentleman across the other side of the aisle for bringing this important legislation to the floor. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, for...
I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Nolan, who has often been a voice for diplomacy on these issues.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, the simple truth is America has no business involving itself in this Saudi-led civil war in Yemen. That's why I introduced my amendment, which passed the House just last July, declaring that none of the funds in the National Defense Authorization Act will be used to deploy ground troops in Yemen. But the fact is the United States is still financially supporting this Saudi-led war, and that's simply wrong for 3 primary reasons. First off, America's support for this Saudi-led war in Yemen is unauthorized. Congress never approved a declaration of war in Yemen. Nothing could be more clear in the Constitution of the United States as to who has responsibility for declaring wars. It's not the President, it's the Congress of the United States of America. But right now, we are still financially supporting a Saudi air war and a blockade in Yemen, both acts of war. It's time to put a stop to that. Second, we're supporting this Saudi-led blockade that's causing a horrific starvation, disease, and death in Yemen. This blockade has forced more than 7 million people in Yemen to the brink of starvation. It has sparked the world's largest cholera crisis in recorded history, and more than 8,000 people in Yemen have been killed and nearly 50,000 injured in airstrikes and fighting on the ground. It is unconscionable for us to continue support for this war. And finally, I can't say enough. America is already involved in too many endless wars of choice in the Middle East. The President of the United States acknowledged that we have spent $6 trillion just on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. $6 trillion. And they have acknowledged that we have $2 trillion in expenses going forward taking care of the heroes that served our nation, lost arms and legs and irreparable damage. That's $8 trillion. Think about it. For one of those trillion, just one of them, we could have eliminated student debt in America. Think about it. For another one of those trillion, there's our trillion for our infrastructure. Think about it. For another one of those trillion, we could have found a cure for cancer or diabetes or Alzheimer's or any one of a number of things. These wars of endless wars of choice where we have inadvertently been on virtually every side of the conflicts one way or another, one time or another, are so costly in blood and treasury. It's time to put a stop to spending these trillions on these wars and start reinvesting in America, reinvesting in the American people. Mr. Speaker, bottom line, Congress must stand up and bring an end to the American involvement in these costly wars and now in Yemen, where we have no authorization and we have no business being involved. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Minnesota yields. The gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith. He's chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I thank my good friend for yielding. Mr. Speaker, House Resolution 599 urges a political solution to the war in Yemen, condemns Iranian efforts to fuel the deadly violence, and calls on all parties to the conflict to increase efforts to adopt all necessary and appropriate measures to prevent civilian casualties and to increase humanitarian assistance. Events of the past week demonstrate the urgency of resolving this perilous conflict. On Saturday, November 4th, Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen fired an Iranian-made ballistic missile at Saudi Arabia's capital. By Monday, Riyadh, in the midst of a massive palace shakeup, described the attack as an act of war by Iran and ordered all Yemen's land, sea, and airports of entry closed. Saudi Arabia said the port closures were necessary to prevent Iran from continuing to arm the Houthis. But the move also spelled dire consequences for Yemen's civilian population, suffering under its third year of punishing wartime conditions. In a country where nearly 70% of the population needs some form of humanitarian and protection assistance, port closures have the distinct look of collective punishment. Although Saudi Arabia this morning announced it would begin lifting the restrictions, this dramatic sequence of events underscores the potential this war has on any given hour or day to explode into a regional confrontation and an even greater humanitarian catastrophe. From the regional perspective, Yemen remains a critical foothold for Iranian influence on the southern flank of the Middle East. The conflict there allows the Iranian regime to cynically sow instability that redounds to its own benefit and that of other avowed enemies of the United States and our allies. Gaps in governance around the region have served as an entryway for Iranian influence, most notably in Syria and Iraq, where Iran and Hezbollah leveraged the emergence of ISIS and al-Qaeda to extend their influence. Tehran is playing at a similar game in Yemen, where its campaign to undermine the country's government has benefited Iran-aligned Houthi militias, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, and the Yemen's ISIS affiliate. From a humanitarian perspective, Mr. Speaker, the ongoing costs of the war are absolutely catastrophic. In late September, the ICRC, International Red Cross, warned that Yemen's cholera outbreak is exploding. It's now at 750,000, could reach 1 million by the end of this year. In July, the WHO called Yemen's cholera outbreak the worst in the world. In March of this last year, Mr. Speaker, I chaired a congressional hearing on the growing threat of cholera and other diseases in the Middle East. At the time, we focused on especially on the outbreak in Iraq and Syria, brought by the collapse of the healthcare sectors and the sanitation infrastructure. Today, that epidemic now is in Yemen, and it has overtaken even Iraq and Syria. I yield back, and I appreciate the resolution.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna.
Thank you. I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, who is a constitutional law professor.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. What's unfolding in Yemen today is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. The war in Yemen has already claimed more than 10,000 civilian lives, according to the UN. With this gruesome death toll as a backdrop, the UN is now warning that Yemen is facing the largest famine that the world has seen in many decades. According to Matthew Nims, the acting director of USAID's Food for Peace program, who testified before Congress, famine is on the agenda now because the Saudi-led military campaign in Yemen is, quote, using hunger as a weapon of war. But using hunger as a weapon of war, as a way to assault and destroy the civilian population, is completely in disregard of the laws of war. But that weapon is proving to be brutally effective. More than 7 million Yemenis are food insecure tonight, which is a polite way of saying they are on the brink of starving to death. As we speak, more than 2 out of 3 Yemenis have no idea where their next meal will come from. Meantime, the Saudi-imposed military blockade and the deliberate targeting in Yemen of water and sewage systems, along with hospitals and schools, have engendered in that country the largest civilian cholera crisis in recorded human history. More than 900,000 people are suffering from a massive outbreak of cholera, a bacterial disease that causes severe and painful diarrhea and dehydration, and which has already killed more than 2,000 women, men, and children. The U.S. must act to save the people of Yemen. We are implicated because we have been refueling Saudi and UAE bombers and offering weapons, intelligence, and logistical support to the Saudi campaign, despite the fact that Congress has never declared war or authorized military operations there. We must do everything in our power to end the blockade on humanitarian assistance and to reopen the pipeline of critical supplies, food, water, and medicine to the Yemeni population. Congress has never authorized U.S. involvement in the Saudi-led war. I could understand that happening in Saudi Arabia itself, where there is no constitution and where the oil monarchy governs according to Sharia law and promotes Wahhabist extremism all over the world. But this is America, and we have been enabling a brutal war which has driven millions of people to the point of starvation without any declaration of war or explicit legal authorization. The UN humanitarian coordinator now says this is the greatest humanitarian crisis since 1945, and hundreds of thousands or millions of people may die if the blockade is not lifted. While we celebrate Thanksgiving, mass starvation may have overtaken Yemen, yet the blockade is still very much in force. We must do everything in our power to speed humanitarian assistance to the civilian population, to work towards a diplomatic solution in Yemen, to stop the atrocities on all sides, and to bring real peace to the region. I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Francis Rooney, the Vice Chairman of the Committee on Foreign Affairs.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support HRES 599, seeking a political solution in Yemen and putting pressure on Iran to stop their nefarious activities there. And I'd like to thank Chairman Royce and Mr. Khanna for bringing this to the floor today. You know, like Hezbollah in Syria, these Houthi rebels are just another Iranian proxy, nurturing Iranian hegemonic ambitions in the region, which continue to destabilize the Middle East and impede our efforts to reinforce the historic Sunni balance of power. A few thousand Houthis, a distinct minority, are trying to subjugate 27 million Yemenis. Iran supported the Houthis' overthrow of the elected president. They continue to export weapons to Yemen, including rockets and ballistic missiles. Some of these things involve anti-ship weapons and mines, which could threaten our own U.S. Navy. And the Houthi rebels have directly attacked Saudi Arabia's property, further escalating the tensions and bringing us to the brink of a broader conflict in the area. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this important resolution to the floor, and I yield.
The gentleman from Florida yields. The gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I really want to thank you, Mr. Engel, for your leadership on this resolution.
Well, the gentleman from New York is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to commend Mr. Khanna for his leadership, because I think that it's important that our newer members come here and really make a difference for these important events all around the world. So I want to thank you. I rise in support of this measure that shines a light on the carnage and suffering that has defined the conflict in Yemen. I want to again thank Mr. Khanna, who has shown real leadership on this issue. He understands the critical role Congress has to play in our foreign policy, why it's so important that this body take the time to talk about the civil war in Yemen and America's involvement. The United States wields tremendous power, diplomatic, military, and developmental, and we have an obligation to debate how those tools are used. We've heard about Saudi and Iranian involvement in the civil war in Yemen. Sadly, Yemenis are caught in the crossfire. The devastation of Yemen's infrastructure has led to 900,000 cholera cases. At least one Yemeni child dies every 10 minutes on average from malnutrition, diarrhea, or respiratory tract infections. Last week, the Saudis intercepted a missile targeting Riyadh. In response, the Saudi-led coalition closed all Yemeni ports of entry. Since last week, no humanitarian assistance has been allowed to enter Yemen. Fuel shortages are limiting access for USAID, and at a time when more than 75% of Yemenis require some level of assistance, including 6.8 million people entirely reliant on food aid. So the people of Yemen are facing a very dire situation. But let's be clear, neither military action nor food aid will solve the conflict in Yemen. A political solution is essential for moving Yemen towards stability. That will require some compromise, an exit strategy for the Yemeni government's Gulf partners, and a real commitment by the international community to prevent Iranian weapons from getting into Yemen. So what does all this mean for America's role? As this resolution notes, the United States provides mid-air refueling for the Saudi-led coalition and participates in intelligence cooperation. Today's debate reminds us that the United States is engaged with partners around the world under a range of authorities. Some of these activities are covered by a current authorization for the use of military force, AUMF. Some are not. In my view, we should have more clarity about the way we use American military might, not just in Yemen, but around the world. After all, it's Congress's responsibility to declare war or to limit a president's authority to wage war when necessary. I've said for years that we should sunset the 2001 AUMF. We voted then to give the President authorization to go after the people and groups that attacked on 9/11. We never intended it to be a blank check. Today we face new threats, threats unrelated to the terrorists who attacked my hometown, New York City, on September 11th. We owe it to our men and women in uniform to have a thorough and honest debate before we send them into harm's way, to stand in this body and say yes or no before we ask them to put their lives on the line. This measure helps to move that debate forward. I'm glad to support it. I urge all members to do the same. I thank Mr. Khanna for his leadership, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York yields. The gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, senior member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As former chairman of the Middle East Committee of Foreign Affairs and having traveled to Yemen myself a couple of years ago, I rise in support of H.R. 599, a bill that calls for an end to the conflict in Yemen and denounces the targeting of innocent civilians and the use of civilians as human shields. It's become painfully evident that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard continues to transfer increasingly sophisticated weapon systems to the Houthis in Yemen. These weapons are now being used to target civilians as well as one of our regional allies, Saudi Arabia. There's an urgent need for a political solution in Yemen with growing famine, 500,000 new cholera cases, and the death of 10,000 Yemeni civilians since 2015. So I rise in support of this bill, and I urge my colleagues to join in condemning Iranian activities in Yemen and call on our global partners to take appropriate measures against the government of Iran, including the banning of Iran's weapons to the Houthis and condemning targeting of civilians. Yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank again Chairman Royce for working with us to get to this resolution. I want to acknowledge people on my own team, staff, Gio Saba, who really led the efforts with Keen Pott from the Progressive Caucus, Chris Schlosser, and Pete Spiro. And also want to recognize Mira Resnick and Mark Iozzi, who really helped with the language. And of course, the peace groups who brought this important cause to the Congress. I know there is some disappointment in wanting to go further, and people are very sincere in wanting to help civilians who literally face famine and cholera. But I believe democracy is a messy process, a long process. There are, as I mentioned earlier, 435 members from different parts of the country. And I think today we have shown good faith in taking a step forward, in highlighting the issue, in calling for humanitarian assistance, in making sure that we curtail our support for Saudi bombing. And I am confident that with the continued involvement of everyone in this body, we will ultimately uphold our values and human rights, which every person in this chamber cares about. With that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, part of the complexity here in this tragedy is that Iran does want to turn the Houthis into a Yemeni version of Hezbollah, thereby turning Yemen into a second Lebanon, where a militia is constantly holding the government hostage. We do face a challenge here in the sense that they are firing Iranian missiles on a regular basis into Saudi Arabia, at cities across Saudi Arabia, including firing on Riyadh, the capital. Now, we have not committed American forces to fight against the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and I do not believe the American people want us to. We should not. Our main involvement has been in the form of humanitarian assistance and our long-standing pre-existing security relationships with regional partners, Saudi, UAE, Gulf Coordination Council. I don't disagree that we must push them to improve their operations, to better avoid civilian casualties and humanitarian harm. But it is a dangerous delusion to think that distancing ourselves from those security relationships would serve the cause of peace and security in Yemen and the region. It would do the opposite. House Resolution 599, in my opinion, is a very responsible reaction to the ongoing crisis, but it expresses the urgent need for a political solution in Yemen, calls on all parties to prevent civilian casualties, promote humanitarian access, condemns Iran for its continuing destabilizing activities in Yemen in violation of the UN Security Council, and I thank Mr. Khanna for this resolution.
The gentleman's time has expired. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to the order of the House of Wednesday, November 1, 2017, the previous question is ordered on the resolution. The question is on adoption of the resolution. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The resolution is agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, on that I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking the vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and the nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings of this question will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12